Hello, this is Jasmine, and today I'm bringing you an artwork that I did for my 2024 winter drop, my stickers and print merch bundle, and I'll talk about that more later at the end of the video because it's out right now and it's only out in the winter. But that being said, I thought this would be a really good video to give you guys my personal tips and tricks when it comes to working with alcohol markers, because this is almost entirely an alcohol marker piece. So I've got this dragon here. I already know that it's going to be a very light colored dragon. And so I'm working with these colored liners that are very pastel. I love these ones. They're called Le Pen. I know they have various other liners, but this is a pastel pack. And the pale purple was just working great for me. And what you want to do, my tip here, is make sure you test your markers with whatever liner or pens or other mediums that you're going to be using. For example, these Le Pen fine tip pens, I have tested them both with alcohol markers and with water, and I know that they're water soluble, but they do not react to the alcohol-based markers. And because of this testing, I know that it's perfectly safe to shade in this dragon with pale colors, shade the snow and all of that. And I also want to emphasize that you need to test these materials on the material that you're going to be coloring. So this is a sketchbook, so I had plenty of areas that I could test it within the sketchbook. But you want to make sure, because some papers and such don't absorb the ink in the same way, so it might reactivate. I have that issue later on because I put Micron on top of gouache, and because the Micron ink did not completely soak into the gouache the way it would the fibers of a paper, it reactivated with water. So you want to keep that in mind while you're working. I went in with different colors for each different part of the dragon. So it's going to have these rainbow crystal-like scales going down, or spines going down its back. And this is all just stylistic choice, but I thought it was a really fun way to go semi-lineless, but it's not actually lineless. It just kind of hides the lines a little bit because they're a darker color. I thought it was really interesting. I've never done that before, but that's not really a marker tip so much as just an interesting stylistic choice that I took. And I hope everybody enjoys all of the kitty intermissions. I had so many Saturn and Eevee intermissions. Saturn is the black polydactyl kitty, and Eevee is the orange kitty. So I went in and I also did the snow, which is going to be white in a pale blue color. I didn't do it in the same color as the dragon, even though the dragon's going to be white, because I wanted to differentiate there, right? And I made sure to erase the graphite. That is another tip. Graphite tends to smudge with alcohol-based markers. It's not super important if you're doing dark colors, but we're doing a lot of pastel here, and I just didn't want the texture of the graphite lines in the background. Now, most of the time I work light to dark with my alcohol markers, unless I know that there's a large area of darkness that I need to fill in. And what I'm doing here is I wanted these lights to have this pastel glowing kind of effect, but I didn't have a color that matched exactly. So I take the colorless blender and I touch the tip of the marker to the colorless blender, and then I use the colorless blender to color. it's going to make a very fine gradient. So it's going to start out a little bit dark, almost the normal color, depending on how long you hold the tips together. And then it's going to quickly fade into nothing because the colorless blender is, of course, no color. I did that for all of these lights because I wanted that very quick but fade to nothing kind of gradient. I wanted to say gradient, but it's not really a gradient between two colors, although you can do that this way too. I just really needed to be able to get things like the red to be the same shade of red for the glowing effect. And I think it turned out pretty good. Now, this is another tip. Always, if you have to refill your marker, refill it over not your artwork, over something else, and refill it over something that it can't soak through. So when you see the nib like that and it's white, that means it does not have any juice in it and it is dying. So I refill slowly until there is enough ink, and there we have it. I put it over the top of the artwork and it dripped. That is, do not do that. When you refill your marker, make sure you scrub it onto a separate piece of paper, get any excess ink off of it, because when you're refilling it, it might take a while for that nib to get saturated like it did for me. It seemed fine, and then it dripped. Luckily, what I did was I used the colorless blender to scrub at that area, because colorless blender, it doesn't erase, but it will spread that ink. So it spread it and made it more dilute, therefore more pale. But luckily that was a pale color that I dripped, and it was the color I was going to use on the dragon. So big mistake, but managed to completely cover it up. It could have been disastrous if it was a different color, like the red, for example. Let's see, another tip. I'm just doing these like as I'm watching the video. I'm not pre-scripting them, which is probably pretty obvious. Transparent stuff. I do a lot of transparent things. I have a lot of fun with it. I'm not exactly amazing at it, but I think I do pretty decent. And so I go in with my pale color and just define the shadows, but I'm leaving any other area, like larger surface areas, completely transparent. But what I do is those larger areas I don't define quite as well. Sorry for the color shift here. It was a separate recording day and it just did that. So for example, the lights or the spines on the back of the dragon, I made sure to blend them out pretty good with the colorless blender after I put them down, just to like fade and fuzz them out. And I also just did not go as intensely with any of the colors that are going to be behind the transparent wings. But we will get back to transparency a little bit later in the video. I'm working on the snow here, and as I mentioned before, the dragon is white and the snow is white. So what can you do to really separate them if you want to? You could want like a camouflage sort of effect, something a little more realistic like that. But I wanted the character to still be the main focal point and be quite separated from the snow. So I took something very similar tonally to the shadows of the dragon, but a different color. This is more representing the cold, icy blue of the snow, and maybe reflecting in the shadows the deep blue sky, whereas the dragon has more of this purpley, maybe slightly more warm tone body. Not exactly a marker tip, but I do want to point out that if you're going to be drawing snow-covered trees like evergreens, I find that it's easiest to find the basic shape and then block out the large areas where the snow has accumulated on the branches, these kind of almost teardrop shapes, and that once you do that, you just kind of darken up the centers and you've got a really great semi-realistic snowy tree. Okay, so another tip that I have is when you're going to be filling in a large area with Copic markers, like this is the ground, for example, and I think it's a good idea to choose something that you either know is going to be somewhat patchy or textured, like the ground is, or to do something like I did with the background, where you break it up with some kind of element into a lot of smaller areas, because that won't show streaks nearly as bad. If you do have a large area you need to cover, I recommend doing like small circular kind of motions really slowly with the nibs, so you really saturate the paper. But I don't prefer to do large areas in marker. There's other mediums that work quite great with that. When it comes to marker, I think smaller detailed work is really the strong suit. So here I'm going in with a darker color. Like I said, I like to work light to dark, so we got that light base in because we can't really erase with alcohol-based markers. Although, again, I will go in at a later point and add some highlights, and I'll talk about that later. But I kind of go crazy with these layers for things like grass, and I add a lot of texture. I'm not looking at super fine details yet because it will all kind of blend in the more layers you add. And do not be afraid to add layers with your markers. It's one of the coolest things about the alcohol-based markers is that you can just layer them up. Obviously, eventually your paper is going to get too saturated, but look at that. I added in all these dark elements for the grass, and then I go with even darker grasses, and so the previous color ends up being sort of a shadow or like textures of grass in the background. And I also recommend using a few different colors for this kind of thing. Don't go too crazy. Make sure you know what color scheme you're doing, but I think adding a few pops of different hues can really bring a piece together. I pull a lot of blues into this one, although there are also some very strong yellow elements. Here you see me going in with the colorless blender into those transparent wing sections. There was a couple pieces I think that I missed, and this is me coloring around those snow blobs. Like I was saying, it just very quickly brings together the likeness of an evergreen tree that's all covered in snow. And what you do is you keep the central area where the trunk would be and whatnot very, very dark. If it's from this far away, it's just going to look like green shadows, and I'm working with more blue tones in the background. Another just general tip is that the farther something is in the distance, the more atmospheric perspective is going to make it pale, and that can be very tricky. It's going to lean more pale and it's going to lean more blue toned. A good way to break up the tonality in your piece is to have a dark element of the background, but then you have your far background that's obviously quite a bit more pale because of that atmospheric perspective. And thumbnails can really be your best friend in this scenario. You don't actually have to draw out an entire separate little sketch. You can just take the markers that you plan on using and put them down in a small little space in roughly the amounts and areas that you would want. So for example, here I would have a dark green strip, and then I would put a paler green strip above it, and then roughly another third of that would be this paler brown color. And you could very quickly get a feel for the balance. It's not about the detail, it's about the balance that you want in your piece. And there's a lot of snow here, so that's all going to get covered with a bit of a bluish hue later. It is always nice though to have that darker area, maybe towards the horizon, but something to break the page up. Here I'm going in straight over the top with this pale blue color, and I'm really separating the background from the foreground at this point, but I'm also going to go around and make sort of a vignette sort of effect, so to make it so that the focal point is the lantern. And that's another thing you want to pay close attention to when you are using alcohol-based markers, is your light source. Keep your light source and your shadows consistent. That's important in all mediums, but markers are very unforgiving. If you put down a dark mark where the highlights are, you're going to have to go back in with paint or something else to bring that back out to be an actual highlight. So that is why this dragon has this very bright area on its chest and its face, and then I've got those shadows on top. And the entire background is supposed to be a bit more muted and mid. It's really supposed to be about this dragon popping out. The lantern is reflecting a bit onto the snow. It does not reflect as much onto the earth because it's not as reflective of a surface. So also keep your surfaces in mind. At this point, I want to talk about another big important thing, which is don't be afraid of mixed media. I know there's a lot of purists out there, but don't let them scare you away from being like, oh, this piece needs a little extra something, and using mixed media other than a white gel pen. So here I go in with gouache, and I really bring out some of the highlights in those transparent areas of wings. I go in transparently, and it leaves some areas kind of dark and some areas get this highlight, and it just works very, very well. I also love to use white gouache to add in atmosphere in the background. And here I'm going in with some added detail as well. It's just a really nice tool and works great with marker, but I also recommend colored pencil and pens and anything that you feel like would add an extra something. I use gel pens a lot. And right here, I believe this is just straight up watercolor. I go in very carefully over the top of the gouache because it will reactivate. However, that gives kind of a extra misty feeling. I could do this part with alcohol-based markers, but it would use up a lot of ink, and I think this gives an interesting mixed media effect here. I'm just doing that sort of vignette color. I also want to point out I added a bunch of yellow highlight to the dragon from the lantern that I was talking about, and if you're working with markers and you're not going to add those highlights with paint, you want to be very careful to make sure you leave space for your highlights. Basically, think ahead when you're using markers. And if you want like a rim light, that's extremely popular. Make sure you don't color all the way to the edge of your character, and you can just add that color in at the end or even the beginning, but it might get a little blurred. So that's the one light color that I do tend to leave towards the end, is the very end highlight or rim light, reflected light, that kind of thing. I will also go in sometimes with different hues towards the end. I'm doing a little bit more reflection here in the spines and that sort of thing. But if I was going to add some pinks and blues or something to the shadows, sometimes I'll do that with a paler color towards the end, but you want to be careful because pale colors will push darker colors away when it comes to alcohol-based markers, so you could end up with a patchiness. I recommend testing these out. So if you have a darker color, I recommend putting it on a little test piece of paper and using your other hue over the top of it and seeing if it's one of those markers that's going to push it away, or if it's just the right tone that it's going to mesh instead. There's not really a hard and fast rule for this that I have seen, because sometimes they seem like a similar value color, but they do not mesh well. I think that's pretty much it for my tips with the alcohol-based markers. There's some obvious ones, like when you're blending with the brush tip, you tend to make a flicking motion. People call this feathering, and it makes it easier to blend. But I think those are a lot more commonly talked about. Now that we're at the end here, I do want to give a quick plug to my own artwork. I thought it would be fun to share this piece because I'm working on my 2025 winter bundle, and I want to put out a winter bundle every year if possible. I think it would be fun. But right now, this bundle is out. This was the 2024 winter bundle, and you get a print of this dragon, as well as a sticker of this dragon. It's a holographic sparkly sticker. It's a 3-inch sticker. And then there's a couple others. They don't exactly match the theme, but I love them. These are my peppermint kitties. And we've got this sparkly peppermint tiger with its cute little peppermint babies. I love these stickers. They are waterproof and fade resistant. I mean, nothing is completely fade proof. I have stuff on a car that has been out in the sun forever, and you know, in all transparency, you don't want to leave it out in the sun for like a year. But we also have these 3 peppermint kitty stickers. Those are separate stickers. They're just cut out of a sheet. And those are available right now on my Etsy and my Ko-fi. And bye, thanks for stopping by.